skip. Make that nice and big. Make sure the stream's working okay. And it is. Awesome. Okay, so you don't need Mischief. You don't have it on your machines. You just need Photoshop open, and you need that template document that we used before, that 5,000. What I want to talk about this morning, and just kind of get everyone's brain in the right frame of mind for, is this. Is the science of light, and start thinking about how light actually works. Like some of you tackled that. I kind of had a look over people's shoulders, and I did a bit of wandering around last week when you were tackling that Spider-Man shot. And some of you kind of do understand how light works with a fair amount of kind of competency. But I think it's really important before we really start to dig down into designing light, that what we actually do is take a step back and think about the science of it and think about the physics of it. Now, you guys are animators, so you should think of yourself as students of physics. Not physicists, that's a little bit too far, but students of physics, because you should always be thinking not just about how something looks, but how it lives, how it moves, how it interacts with its environment, and how two objects behave together when in close proximity, and how one object reacts to another. That's a key component of what being an animator is about. You're always thinking about how objects relate to one another and what those relationships are. And the science of light is exactly the same. So there's a few little things I want to go through this morning before we start looking at this actual challenge. The first one is this guy. There it is, my almost scientifically perfect depiction of the sun. The sun. The sun is our almost omnipresent light source. Yeah, it's the one thing. It's probably actually the only thing in your entire life that you have been absolutely assured of at all times. It's the only constant in our lives, even more so than things like air. Air is not a constant if you're at a swimming pool, but light is always there. And yet, actually, sometimes we fail to understand exactly how light works and how light behaves. So let's say that's the sun. You probably think he's gone mad. He's drawing like a 5-year-old. No, I don't want that. Let's go back. Let's undo that. I want the green floor. There's the sun, and there's the floor. And there's this common kind of misconception that light rays, when they come from the sun, they sort of do this. So you've got one light ray there, and you've got one light ray there, one light ray there. Yeah? So this is just a commonly kind of held belief that that's kind of how the sun works, is that when we're down here on Earth, and that it kind of hits us with light rays, and this is what it looks like. So what that would mean is, like, if you've got is my awful tree. Got a tree here, and the sun and the trees here, it will be kind of shadowy here. But if we put a tree kind of over here, more or less the same size, but because this tree's over here, it will be shadowy here, like this. And you see the difference between the depiction of light in those two images. That is completely, 100% factually incorrect. That is not how light works at all, particularly the sun. That is not how the sun works. And the reason the sun doesn't work that way is because if that is the sun, that is the Earth. Did you even see that? Yeah, that tiny little dot there. That's us. Which means that this behavior is not accurate. That is not how the rays of the sun hit us. What actually happens is that the sun behaves more. I'm just going to make a very quick change because I know that it can do this. Where is it? Smooth this. There you are. The sun actually behaves more like this. It's the rays of light move almost in parallel. And the reason for that is because we are so small against the emitter. So the emitter of light, the sun itself, is enormous, and we are tiny, which means that its rays come straight at us. Okay? Now that's the first thing to remember. So if you've got an omni-light, like the sun, like daylight, everything that is hit by daylight will have a similar structure in the way its shadows are built. So the absence of light will be in almost the same position for all objects. Okay? And that's because of that scale thing. If you look at, and you see this day, like it's one of these things we see it every day, but maybe we fail to notice it. If you go to the beach on a sunny day and you see 100 people standing in the midday sun, everybody's shadow is tiny and under their feet. Yeah, they don't all have slightly different shaped shadows depending on where they're standing on the beach. Yeah, everybody's got the same shadow. So that's the first thing to remember. Light moves in almost near parallel waves towards us. So it all kind of moves down in this same direction. So the next thing we need to think about, so if that's a truth, this is where you discover how chronically dyslexic I am, because I can't actually spell parallel. I'm going to say it's spelled like that, and no one's going to question me. So if that's the first truth, the second truth, or second set of truths actually, are around, so we've got reflection, diffusion, and occlusion. Now, if you have done any stuff in 3D, you should be fairly familiar with these things, especially if you're a modeler or if you build shaders, or even if you're just interested in lighting and rendering. Okay, so let's go back to what do all these words mean. So, in terms of a surface material, there's a couple more machines here. I feel like people are in the wrong bookings. You should be in the same bookings you were in last week, but hey ho, let's just work with what we got. So let's talk about reflection first. When a light hits an object, it bounces off it. There are very few materials that perfectly absorb light. The vast majority of materials reflect either all or a vast majority of light. If materials didn't reflect light, none of you would be able to see anything. Okay, because we don't see things, we see light bouncing off of things. That's how our eyes work. It's really important to remember that. And it's the way that bounce occurs that defines these three things. So if we have a smooth surface, so let's say I've got something like super smooth, like a sheet of glass, or relatively smooth, like a sheet of glass. What's going to happen to that glass when the light hits it is the rays will come down here, and they will bounce straight back up like so. The one next to it, hit there, bounce straight back up. That's what causes reflection. A smooth surface will reflect a sharp ray. It will keep the trajectory of a light ray consistent. Yeah, so they'll all hit at the same angle, they'll all reflect at the same angle, and the smoother the surface, the more likely that is to happen. It's also to do with density of surface terrain as well. So even though we say, oh, it's really dense and really smooth, therefore it reflects, that doesn't mean that all reflective materials are solid. Water is a great example of a material that is an element that is incredibly reflective, but is not solid. The reason that it is reflective is because its particles move in very close proximity to one another without being compressed, and it creates a smooth surface. They're able to pack down tightly. So let's just kind of look at the opposite of that then. So if that's reflection, what's diffusion and how does that work differently? And apologies if you know this, but if you know it, you should be able to draw it. And I've yet to see anyone draw it, so that's why we're doing it. So let's talk about a diffusion surface. So let's say our surface that our light's hitting is not smooth. Let's say it's rough, like that. Now something very interesting is going to happen when light hits this surface. So let's pick our angle. So let's say the light's coming down at this angle. So it hits just there. It's going to hit that surface. This light is going to bounce that way. Let's say another ray comes down, hits just here. Well, this one's going up that way. There's another one moving in parallel there. So this one is going to hit here. It's coming to that quite shallow, so it's probably going to go up at that kind of angle. It's slightly off from the one before. Let's do another one. So this one's going right down here. It's crossing that way. It's going up. Can you see what's happening here? Is that on a diffused surface, when light hits it, it's not all reflecting in the same direction. Yeah, it's moving in a very, very different manner. It's behaving differently. And that's because of that kind of reaction to the surface that it makes contact with. So why does this matter? Well, we're not all not everything in the world is made of the same material. It doesn't have the same surface. And understanding the surface and the local construct of objects when we're designing shots and designing materials, designing characters, designing buildings, whatever it might be, we have to start thinking about theory like this. Like, what if light is hitting this? If I'm placing a light here, how does that light behave when it hits a certain material? And why is that going to differ between two different objects? Okay, and that is the difference between a reflection, which is a sharp kind of cut of light. A light all bounces in the same direction. We get a clear reflection. And a diffusion, what diffusion effectively does is it allows light to travel across an object. So notice how much ground, if I just highlight this in red, notice how much ground this is covering. So these reflections, just these 4 rays, are covering that much space. Yeah, they're actually, you know, as in terms of the light traveling back up, they're covering all of that. By comparison, if this was a surface that was completely smooth and they all bounced, they would cover a space about this big. Yeah, because they'd all hit together, they'd all bounce together in exactly the same direction. Yeah, they'd all go up this way. All right. So this is the difference in how we see light. Sometimes it will diffuse across a surface. Yeah, it will carry across a surface, and we'll get a really gentle transition from light to dark. And if the object's smooth, we'll get a hard cut across the surface. And we need to be really aware of how different surfaces behave. So skin is an incredibly textured material. It's millions of tiny little grooves and channels within it, which means when light hits our skin, it does not reflect cleanly. It diffuses across the surface. By comparison, a sheet of glass, a sheet of plastic, these are hard surfaces with smooth structures. Light will bounce straight off them. Okay, metal as well, especially polished metal. Yeah, buffered metal will reflect light really harshly. So what I want to do this morning, before we set this quite complex challenge, is I would like you to evidence that you understand exactly how to construct a three-dimensional shape with light. Because you're going to have to do this, and it's going to play a key part in how you design shots from this point onwards. You're not just plonking characters down and drawing a line for the horizon. You know, this is we're beyond that now. We're pushing further than that. So, I'll just give you a quick couple of seconds to do this. I'd like everyone to log in, open up Photoshop. I would like you to create a 5,000 by 5,000 pixel canvas at 72 pixels per inch. I'm going to do the same, and then create just a new layer within it. There's a spare one there, and there's one over the back. So this is what we're thinking about. Oh, sorry, I missed one. I didn't talk about occlusion. Open your Photoshop file, and then we'll talk about occlusion. Where are we? 5,000.
I might have the same error that somebody else had last time.
Okay, just jump on one of the other ones. Yeah, these are all these machines are going for a big update today. So hopefully. Okay, full screen. That's a bit better. Okay, so I want you to have something like that. So we've got that open. Let's just do a quick discussion of what we mean by occlusion. The sun can stay.
What about the background color?
Should be 50, shouldn't it?
Yeah, it should be 50. 50 should just be your standard. But it's just a great... Working on white is a strain on the eyes. Working on 50 is just easier to work with, especially if you're sketching. So we were talking about occlusion. So let's just do a quick example of what we mean by occlusion. Okay, so here's my super rough surface. Here's my light rays coming down. So let's make it a bit darker so you can see it on the screen. Remember what we said about all those light rays moving near parallel to one another? So how does occlusion work? Well, occlusion works like this. So that was that light ray. This one's gone off this way. This one, it's really tight actually. That's almost going to hit that way. This one's just going to keep on going. This one's going up that way. See that? Look how much space distance we're covering now. If I were to carry these all the way out, and you'll see just how far spread that light is as it moves. Sorry, this is a bit messy, but there's something really important in this image to remember. And this one is going to go that way, really tight. Okay, so the important thing to remember on this, we've got this hard surface. This really, sorry, not hard surface, this really kind of textured, rough surface. You've got the light coming down or in near parallel, and then bouncing all off at different angles, just like it was in the last drawing, yeah? Depending on the surface angle defines how the light is going to reflect. But there's something really, really important that's happening here, and that is this bit. Notice how, because of the position of the light, it just isn't reaching down to the bottom of this crevice. Okay? That is our occlusion point. Objects that have significant indentation within their surface texture will have occlusion lines. Areas where the light just does not hit. Okay? If you want to see an occlusion line in the flesh, put your hand in front of you like that. And you'll see that you can see your fingers individually. And the reason you can see all of your individual fingers and it's not just one shape is because you've got lines of occlusion where the light just isn't hitting. Yeah, you see those dark patches in your fingers, those really gentle lines. That's occlusion. Light is not getting into that space. Okay? Obviously, if you ramp the light up in the room, eventually you could wipe that occlusion line out. Okay, but that's the idea of these deep crevices are occlusion lines. This is why we keep line art in, and actually the traditional mode of line art drawing, especially for film concept art, is you draw the occlusion lines. Yeah, the lines you draw on a page are where light isn't hitting. Yeah, and then you fill in the light over the top of that. So that was just something to kind of bear in mind, that there will be these points where light doesn't hit. So what I'd like you to do in Photoshop, I'd like you to open up, so open your file up, create a new layer, which you can see I've done over here. I'm just going to go to this elliptical marquee tool. You hold down to select the elliptical marquee. I'm going to hold Shift, and I'm just going to draw a marquee of a circle.
Jump on that one then.
Yes, that one doesn't work.
So you want those two.
Okay, so what we're going to do with this it's a very quick task. Some of you may have done this before. I've done this probably 100 times, and actually it's still really valuable because it puts my brain back in the gear it needs to be in to understand how light behaves and how to create shape and depth in my drawings. When we look at like professional concept art and professional story art and professional visual development art, all of those types of materials, just regardless of where they sit in a production pipeline, they all have depth. They all have a sense of actual depth and three-dimensional space to them. That's not an accident, that's by design. The skills are being deployed, which help us understand that. So we're going to just do the sphere task. It's only going to take us like 10 minutes, if that. First thing we're going to do is we're just going to take this sphere and we're going to decide roughly where our light source is. So my light source, just to keep it simple, is going to be omni, so it's going to be daylight, and I'm going to make it my top corner. If you're not going to use your top corner and you want to put it somewhere else for the moment, my recommendation is that you deselect the marquee and then you draw in a little X to mark where your light is. But I'm going to use the top corner. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the sort of general brushes in Photoshop. I'm going to use a soft round brush. I'm going to make sure the hardness is 0. I'm going to make it fairly large as well, so it's quite a fair size. Then what I'm going to do is I know that this background is 50, and if I eyedropper it, it should come out. Did I say 59? Oh, I must have done it. Set the file up wrong. It should say 50 when we eyedropper this space. But what I want to do is I'm actually going to set this down a bit lower. Set it to about 75 roughly. And then what I'm going to do is, if this is my light source up here on this marquee, is I'm going to go in and start to actually paint in. Well, if that's the light source, where is the light not hitting? Where is the point where light is not able to catch this? Because this isn't, I'm thinking of this now, this is not a circle. Now I want to ensure that this is a sphere and it behaves as a sphere. This one, that one doesn't work.
Sorry, mate.
It's okay. Let's hope your machine works. Right. So what I'm going to do now, I've gone back to my 59. I'm just moving up here. I'm just going to round off this edge. So what I'm doing, I'm just working. In fact, I've just realized I've chosen pressure size. I'm going to change it to just generic soft round. There we go. Back to 75 or around 75. So what I'm doing here is I'm just finding that what we call the terminator line. So the terminator line I've just put a new layer in. This is just for your kind of viewpoint. So the terminator line is effectively like the equator of the shape. It's around there. I'll put it in white actually so it really stands out. So just, I mean it's really rough at the moment, but it's around there is the terminator line. So that is the line at which the other session is on at 10:30 if there are no more, 11:30 if there are no more machines left. The terminator line is effectively the point at which a spherical object, the light that's hitting it isn't then making direct contact anymore. Okay, so you've got everything above that is kind of direct contact. The light is hitting that surface in some way or another, and anything below that, there's no direct light. Now, the way that we paint that in would actually define what the surface is made of. So, for example, and this is almost impossible. You will likely never see this in nature, but you could theoretically, because the physics would allow it, you could have a terminator line that looked like that. I know that's not perfectly smooth, but come on, cut me some slack. I'm freehanding it. You could theoretically have a terminator line like that, but you would need two things to happen. You would need a surface that is perfectly smooth and allows for absolutely no diffusion, so it literally hits it like perfect glass almost. Yeah, a perfect shape hits it and bounces off with no diffusion, no transfer across the surface. And you would need a light source that doesn't bleed. And we looked at this when we looked at the do you remember the Wreck-It Ralph story art? We saw how the light kind of bled round the shapes. So you've got this occlusion of light around the forms. So it showed how strong the light source was. So you need a fairly weak light source and a perfectly smooth object. The reality is, in nature, it doesn't exist. So what we're going to do, we're going to go back to this, and now we're going to paint. If that's our terminator line, that point at which light is not making direct contact, we need to add some more information in. So I'm going to get rid of my terminator line, go back to this shape, make my brush nice and big. The next thing we need to add is any occlusion points. So I'm going to take that light source right down to around 95. Never do anything in black. I know I've said this before. Never 100% black. Just don't, because it almost doesn't exist. It's almost impossible to find within any design. So what I would do now is, well, where's the occlusion point? Where is the point where light can't even transfer across the surface? Yeah, where is it absolutely non-existent?
Towards the bottom.
So it's going to be down here, and I'm very gently going to kind of place that in. Not going to be too heavy with it either, because the occlusion point on a sphere is going to be very, very small. It's going to look like that. Yeah, so it's just this point in time where light is absolutely not hitting. So these are all kind of the absent areas. I'm just going to paint that in, just smooth it off a little bit. So the smoother I do this, the rougher the surface, effectively. I'm going to go back to around my 78 point and just... I've done that pressure brush again. I keep picking the wrong one. Should probably just delete it. Soft round, there it is. So, yeah, so it's going to look something like that. I'm going to go back to my 50, make sure I don't ever kind of slip away from my terminator lines, kind of keeping it like that. So now the next thing I'm going to add is, well, if light's coming down from this direction, yes, it's coming this way from my top corner, and that's my terminator line, and that's my occlusion point, there's other things happening. The first thing, before we bear in mind, we haven't actually painted any light yet. This is just the shadow. The light still needs to be added up here as it starts to make contact and reflect or diffuse across the surface. But there's something else happening, is that light doesn't just hit objects. It also goes round them. Okay, so just going back here. Just frantically draw another shape. So if that's my light source and that's my object, and all the light is firing at it like this, in near parallel, this will happen. There will be a point where the light just doesn't hit, yeah, it goes straight past. And the surface of the floor itself, whatever this surface is made of that my object is sitting on, what that's made of will define how this light bounces. Does it all just bounce up in the same direction, yeah, in a really kind of neat fashion? Or does it start bouncing all over the place and going crazy because it's a really rough surface? So I have to now think about this when I'm painting three-dimensional shapes. Because what will happen is, as light hits this, hits around it and hits the surface, it will reflect upwards. So I'm going to take it to about 30. And what you're going to get is make this a little bit smaller because it's a sharper light. You're going to get this. You're going to get light reflecting up and just grazing the surface and reducing the occlusion point slightly. Not enormously, but whoa. Change the colour there. Yeah, not enormously, but it's still going to happen. Yes, you're going to get light. It's going to hit down here and bounce back up and reflect off of this. And then now what I can do is start to think about how light itself is actually painted. So I'm going to make my brush a little bit larger again. Yes, maybe a little bit bigger. So I've got it super soft as well, like no hardness. And then what I'm thinking is, well, if light's coming down, what does it actually look like when it hits this surface? So I can just start to paint that in very gently, not too much. And actually, the strength of the light point, if I were to paint that really hard there, that implies that it's a really smooth surface. Yeah. So the stronger the contact point here, the smoother the surface. If there's no strength in the contact point, if it's really loose, then it implies that actually the light source isn't very strong, or more importantly, that the surface of the material isn't too smooth. Yeah, that it's a rough surface. So that's how, if the light was dead level, dead flat, hitting side on like a perfectly flat angle, that's how the light would behave to create a spherical shape. But that's not necessarily accurate. I'm going to create another layer. This time, so I'm going to go in for that darker, so that's 75. So we said that 75 is kind of, just realised what I've done, worked on the wrong layer there. Go, right. There's that darker patch. I'm just sort of filling that in. Going back to my 59. So what you might also have is the light exists on a z-axis. So the light's maybe not dead level to the object in terms of its depth. Yeah, it's not sitting at the same depth. It's sitting slightly in front of it. In which case, you need to start thinking about, well, what does that do to the shadows? It makes them smaller. Think about the phases of the moon. It makes them smaller and more intense. We'd use a slightly smaller brush, actually, to do that. This is a really, really good exercise for training your brain to think about the way that light works. Yeah, to think about light as a believable three-dimensional construct that needs to be managed. So it's still going to have all of those core components. Back out. Make my brush just a little bit bigger. But what it might have is that when that light actually comes in, put it at 27, make it a bit smaller. Yeah, so when the light comes in, then it's actually here. Yeah? Yeah, so it's hitting the front of that shape, in which case you're going to get really, really strong reflection down here, but almost no reflection over this side. You might get a tiny little bit. You might get like just an accent of reflection like that, but you're not going to get nearly as much as you would normally have. So that's that same shape, but this time that looks horrid on that projector. Yeah, this time the light's in front. Do it again. What if the light's behind? Well, if the light's behind, you're going to get by majority. Let's go up. Yeah, you're going to get, by majority, you're going to get these kind of darker values. You're going to sit more like this. And the lighter ones are just going to creep around the outside edge. You're going to get right down. You're going to see more of that occlusion like that. So that's the light all the way behind. Yeah, same strength of light. I didn't change the values I used, but the positioning of them gives three completely different meanings to the shape. All three of them have a three-dimensional kind of construct to them. And that's how perfectly smooth. So notice how terminus line changes as well, between like a convex and a concave terminus line. So again, why are we doing this? It's just good practice to help you think about how light behaves on three-dimensional surfaces. You're painting buildings, you're painting cars, you're painting traffic lights, you're painting people. You're doing story art that contains human beings that are made of flesh and bone. And you need to think about, how does the light actually behave when I start to paint that kind of subject matter? Yeah, what is the long-term impact on, not sorry, the long-term, but what is the kind of the end impact of light within this scene? So you need to think very, very carefully, not just about where your light is and how it behaves, but also about what objects you have in there. So that's our session 2. I think this is my session 2 file. It's my session 2 file, it looks like it. I don't know, yeah, let's put it all back in here and see what pops up. Yeah, so within this one up here, yeah, so I started to sketch in and kind of rough, like, oh, these are my kind of fundamental shapes. And I started to just map in very loosely what the light was going to look like. So I did a sketch of the environment, of what the environment could look like, which was that really rough sketch. Then I did my characters and kind of overlaid them. And then I was starting to think about, yeah, how does light actually behave within the shape? And I'm pretty sure it was over this side. Yeah, I'd sketched out roughly where the light was in terms of an aerial view. So I've got all the planning documents I need. And what I need to do now is actually to really kind of look closely at the way that light is behaving in those shapes. So, your third task, your first task was pretty straightforward actually, because we watched it. Yeah, we watched it and we thought about it, and I got you to thumbnail out some really rough ideas. Your second task was a little bit more complex because now I'm asking you to actually go beyond a rough thumbnail sketch and create something that's a little bit more tangible, that gives consideration to light and dark. But ultimately, you still had the same source information to work from. You had the sequence. You could watch it back and try as you best as you could to understand all of the little pieces of material and pieces of information that made up that scene. Yeah, so thinking about where the cars were placed, the colors that were used, the way that light was used in certain instances, like the flashlight, for example, that was effectively almost a character within that first sequence in Into the Spider-Verse. The reality is, though, that when you're making a film, you can't use the film you're making as reference for the thing you're about to make because you haven't made it yet. You don't have that resource. You can't use the end product. You need to develop this from nothing. The other challenge you're going to face, and I think it's really apt that we bring this into reinterpreted composition actually, is that in a professional context, if you're in 12 months' time, bear in mind in 12 months' time you will be gone, right? Or you're off. You're working wherever, working in studios, I would hope, or working in startups or making films or whatever you're doing. There is a fair possibility, in fact I'd say a significant possibility, that you may have to work on something not only that isn't yours, but something that's built on something else. That you will have to reinterpret pre-existing information in order to create a subject. Okay, you will have to. I don't like the term reboot or remake. I think those are lazy words. But I think it's very likely you're going to have to work on something that already exists. So for our final task for these workshops, I'm going to ask you to work on something not only that already exists, but that's already been remade. And I'm going to give you no visual material. You got nothing. Okay, I want you to, using any prior knowledge you have, you can do that because obviously I can't ask you to wipe your own memories. So use the prior knowledge you've got. But what I'd like you to do is to look at this script, pull out 3 shots or 3 beats, so 3 compositions, and I want you to design them all the way from a thumbnail idea through to a piece of lit story art, a piece that would be good enough to pass to a concept artist or pass to a visual development artist to design the whole scene. You have to finish to round it off. Okay? So, I'll pass them both ways. I'll split this in half. It's only 1 sheet, so take 1 sheet, pass it round. We'll do a quick read through. And then we're gonna tackle this head on. We're gonna move through that whole development cycle of analyzing the script, extracting key information, sketching out rough thumbnails, isolating areas of interest, looking for things that, do you remember the rule of things you can't change? Yeah, there will be things that are in capitals that in uppercase, you just cannot manipulate. So we just need to acknowledge them and then, tackle them and kind of address them as best we can. And where is my copy? I've got a feeling I may have left the titles at the top. Did I leave them? I didn't. That's good. Okay. Where's my... No touch on. That's a bit annoying. Oh well. All right. We all got a copy? Put your hand, don't say it out loud, just put your hand in the air if you know the film. Good. Okay, right. Dead traffic light sways overhead, its dripping black lenses glazing back at a boy in a yellow slicker and red galoshes. So I'm just going to go through this as we work and just kind of highlight the stuff, yeah? So there are things here that we can't change. Georgie races down the street past the dark houses after his paper boat, which sluices along a gutter swollen with rushing rainwater. Rain taps on George's hood, sounding to his ears like rain on a shed roof. A comforting, almost cozy sound. The buckles of his galoshes make a merry jingle as he goes. The boat whistles past a blockade of sawhorses marked Department of Derry Public Works. That's important. Remember what that means? It means if you choose this part of the sequence, you have to include it in the shot. You have to, like, if you were to choose that sequence where a gauge on the blacktop extends it sweeping diagonally across toward a storm drain. You know, that whole sentence there. If you were to design that, you have to include a storm drain and a sawhorse marked Department of Derry Public Works. George races after, trying to grab the boat before it's swallowed up by all the rainwater. He slips and spills to the blacktop, crying out in pain. The paper boat surfs up to the drain, circles around twice and goes in. Georgie looked ready to cry. Willie's going to kill me. He walks over to the drain and peers in, water falling into the darkness. A dank, hollow sound comes through within. Suddenly, eyes peer back at him. From the greasy white face of a clown. Not Bozo or Ronald McDonald, but something more old world, freakish like that of a 19th century acrobat. Bald, lithe, almost childlike. Meet Pennywise, aka Bob Gray. Did anyone know that? Pennywise's real name is Bob Gray. It's really unimaginative. Imagine being a trans-dimensional being and saying, I call myself Bob. George recoils, shocked by Pennywise's presence. A voice, perfectly pleasant and reasonable voice, rises up. Hello, Georgie. George looks around him. An old woman watches him from the kitchen window of the house just behind the drain. Cut to POV. Really important there. That's a very specific piece of shot direction there. This is a POV from the woman's house. So we're almost, we're looking over, possibly, I'm not trying to give you ideas, possibly over her shoulder, out the window, at Georgie out in the rain. Yeah? She turns her attention back to her cat, scraping out the wet innards of a can of tuna into a plate on the windowsill. Lost something? Pennywise. George, expression mellows from fear to childlike wonder, like he's seeing a circus bear balanced on a ball. How did you get down there? Me, by the storm, of course, just blew me away, blew the whole circus away. How'd you like to join the circus, Georgie? The faint off-key sound, not important to you because this is musical direction. Of music can be heard. George inches closer to the storm drain. Is there cotton candy? Cotton candy? Oh yes, cotton candy and bearded women and elephant shit and all the balloons a little boy could want. You like balloons, don't you, Georgie? I sure do. Do they float? George takes one last fatal step forward. Float? Oh, indeed they do, Georgie. Indeed they do. Everything down here floats. And when you're down here with us, and that's it. That's what we've got. Now, why are we looking at this? How many of you have seen the original miniseries of this, of it? Okay, a few of you. Don't go and watch it while you're doing this task, please. But go and watch it afterwards. It's very good. For a miniseries, for television, it's quite good. It's very, very well shot for its time as well. It's got a very high kind of production value to it. It's also got cult status. Yeah, that I think it was made in 1980, around 1980. Might be late 80s actually, thinking of the age of some of the cast. It's got cult status. It's recognised as a valuable piece of moving image material. And then the decision was made 5 years ago to remake it. And that's a real challenge. It means that team, those writers and those artists, had to reinterpret information that already exists from two sources as well. They have the book, which contains far more detail than the script does. If any of you have read Stephen King's book, you know he is a real stickler for detail. So they've got that information to work from that they have to interpret. And then they've got the actual original TV series artifact, the mini-series artifact, to reinterpret as well. So it's a really significant challenge for those filmmakers a few years back. But what they did was create something that's actually kind of good. It stands up on its own weight, actually. The kind of remakes of it are very good, and they're not the same. The shot structures are different, but they're still effective. They managed to create the same reaction from their audience and the same kind of emotional, psychological reaction from their audience as the original product and quite possibly as the book, but do it in a different way. It is not a shot-for-shot remake. Okay, shot-for-shot remakes generally don't work. Okay, an example being the mid-90s remake of Psycho that was shot-for-shot and is awful. So if it can be done once, it can be done twice. And the key to this is not to look at the original product, but to find a way to get the same response from your audience. Yeah, don't think about how they shot it and how they built those two previous incarnations. Think about, how can I build a sense of foreboding, a sense of discomfort, a sense of concern for this boy. Yeah, little kids running down the street, just in general, is supposed to incite a fear of discomfort. It is not something we like to see as humans. It makes us feel uncomfortable. How can you elicit that feeling and maximize it? Okay? You also have the benefit of, and this is a genuine benefit, is the subject matter that you have to design. So Bob, I'm going to call him Bob from now on, that subject matter is already scary. You know that your audience for version 3 of it, they're already going to be scared of this character because he already exists as a cultural artifact. That means you can be very clever about how you visualize him and how you show him. You can do better because you don't need to tell the audience they're scared. They're already scared before they've entered the cinema. Okay, you can use that to your advantage. Show them less information, perhaps, or new ways of visualizing that information. All right? Now, with the remake, what they did, and maybe we'll put a trailer up just for you. No, let's not. I don't want to give you anything. I want you to go in really cold with this. But in the remake, the way that they did it is they did the opposite of what happened the first time round. The first film doesn't show much in terms of visceral information, like visceral gore or violence. It really doesn't. Okay, it's a lot of cutaways at the right moment. What it does do, though, is it makes inane and mundane material seem scary. White, like bed sheets out on a washing line, turns into a scary scene. Some balloons in a library. Cleaning a sink. These are really kind of mundane actions that they made them scary. What the remake did was the opposite. Is it took the things that should be scary, that we knew weren't scary the first time round, and made them absolutely terrifying, using jump scares, using visceral information. If anyone knows what I'm talking about, the hand wave thing is a great example of showing more because the last time round it showed less. So think about that. It's not about shot for shot. It's not about making it again. It's about changing the way that information is visualized. So we've got about 40 minutes, okay? And what I would like in 40 minutes is in Photoshop, in your file. We'll create a new one, actually, I think. So we'll go for a new one. We should have this story art template. Why did mine not load? That's a little bit annoying. But what I want you to make then, if you haven't made one already, is one of those story art templates. I did put them on Moodle as well for you, I do believe. But I want you to create 6 frames at 1080 by 1920. Fill none. Stroke black. So it'd be 1920 wide, 1080 high. So what I'd like you to then do with these is, before the end of this session, so you've got 40 minutes, which is really not long, I want you to create 6 thumbnail sketches, which will be 3 different interpretations of one sequence. So you're going to pick 2 pieces of information from the script and create 3 alternative versions of those 2 things. So what it will eventually look like, I don't want this to turn auto select off, is you'll have like this. Let's delete that one. So you're basically going to have this. You're going to have 6 pieces of information. I hate that properties thing. Go away. 6 pieces of information that look like that. So you'll have 3 versions of one piece of the script here and 3 versions of one piece of the script here. My recommendation for this is start by just reading the script through a few times. Get a pencil and write on the script. Make notes of where is there opportunity for interesting visualization and interesting kind of depiction. Okay? I'm going to do the same as well. So I'm going to work on this. I'm going to do it. So you've got a paper version. I'm going to work on it digitally and start highlighting in my script where I'm going to pull out pieces of information. And then within this, we're going to go in, going to create some new layers, and just with a basic, super simple pencil tool, nothing too kind of over the top. I want you to start sketching in different versions. So one idea is not good enough. You need 3 ideas for every selection. Let's see how well you can kind of do with this. All right? And please show some discipline. Don't look at anything like on your devices or on your phones or anything like that to do with this source material. Just use the words. Okay? Because it's entirely possible that at key stages of the production, especially the remake, they would have had whole periods of time when nobody was looking at source material. They would have had loads of it. They'd have had the whole archive of the original TV series out, and it would have been pulling it apart and thinking about how to redesign and reinterpret information, but there would have been periods where they went in cold as well and just designed from scratch what they wanted to do. So, where's mine? Here. Okay. This one's not working. So you'll either, if there's one more machine left that we can sort. If you go to the technician's office, there's one. If you go and ask Suzanne, there's one more in my office. You might be able to grab. Go and speak to her now. Okay, you can swap it in and it'll work. All right.
Because also I have my laptop.
You could do, but that won't connect to your laptop. So you'll have to go and get a tablet from the office. All right.
So, are we going to send the other whole scene or just two shots?
Just so you want to pick two kind of opportunities for shots,
Yeah.
and then do 3 different versions of those shots.
Oh.
Okay. So I've picked up. These are my 2. I've highlighted them in green. Paper boat surfs up to the drain, circles around twice and goes in. George looks ready to cry. And then the next one is this Pennywise's presence of voice. A perfectly pleasant, reasonable voice rises up. Hello, Georgie. So those are the 2 I chose. Try not, if you can, and this is not a hard rule, but my suggestion is if you can, avoid just doing whole pieces of dialogue with no narrative description. Because sometimes it's quite easy to get lost in dialogue, and as we saw in Spider-Man, dialogue naturally leans towards mid-shots and close-ups. Yeah, quite often, not all the time, but there's an inclination to use those kind of shots, which is not always beneficial. So just for my reference, to stop me switching around between the 2 things, I've brought them both into Photoshop. Just lock those down. So just get into that habit of just being organized. Yeah, don't confuse yourself with layers if you don't have to. Oh, it needs to lock in. Sorry. Next session starts in 10 minutes.
Next session.
Yeah, in the next session. So this needs to stay up on the screen for these guys.
Which one's the memorization completion? Does it have the charger?
It's plugged in over there. Okay, so we've only got another 3 minutes on this, and then I'm going to stop you. Also, save you that. Right, folks, if everyone can just stop what they're doing. Just hit Command S, save your work. So this is where, I'm going to read fast with this, but there's just a couple of things I want to show you. Let's show you where mine got to. So I got 2 of mine done straight into digital. So that was a sentence that or the piece of the script that I chose. The paper boat surfs up to the drain, circles around twice and goes in. George looks ready to cry. So what was my first thumbnail? Well, I like the idea of just shooting it from inside the drain and go from that perspective and what would that kind of look like. So I thought, well, the idea of shooting inside the drain wasn't so much about what was outside the drain, but using the drain as a frame to create a really kind of not dynamic, but just an interesting composition within it. So just to break up that frame, because that's what I was thinking. Is actually one of the things that doesn't happen too much in the previous products from my memory is deconstruction of the actual frame itself, like the camera frame. So I thought, well, maybe that's the thing I can play with. So that was the first interpretation, was the idea of shooting inside the drain, and that way you can use the drain to break the frame up into an interesting dynamic. And then the second one is a slightly more abstract, actually. And the idea for this one was, why not just completely ignore kind of the rules around the frame itself and just completely isolate, just step out the frame entirely. So the idea is that this is the actual camera shot, but it's completely flat. So turn it into a flat image of Georgie looking down the drain, and then you black out the rest of the composition and quite literally have Bob just floating in nothing, just floating in black. Just quite an abstract interpretation of that information, of just viewing it in a very, very different way. So those were my first 2 attempts. Now, like I said, I would like you to go beyond this. These are just rough, quick, 10-minute thumbnails, if that. I want you to take it to the next level and go for all 6 of these. So across your 2 statements, there's my other one. George recalls back, shocked by Pennywise's presence. A voice perfectly present rises up. Hello, Georgie. So that's my next bit. So you've got 3 of this one, 3 of this one, but then in fresh layers over the top, go into it. Yeah, actually round it off. Start painting in how light is going to work. You might need to create another file, perhaps, or even maybe if you've made yours a bit tighter packed. I've left lots of gaps between mine. Pack yours a bit tighter. You can create space down the bottom to sketch out an aerial view of where the light design is and where the set design of it. That will help you plan out the light so we can take it to the next level. But that's your kind of final task, is can you complete not just one version, one alternative, but multiple alternatives of the same information. And each one thinking about it in a different cinematic way. Okay? And in terms of light, I just wanted to show you something quickly before we kind of pack up, because we've got the other lot in here very soon. So I went and grabbed some VizDev art from a couple of programs. So I grabbed one from Carnival Row, and the other one is from Love. Is it Love, Death and Robots? Has anyone seen that on Netflix? It's amazing. It's amazing. Particularly the final one. The final one is so over the top. So this should just.
Well, they're in different orders. Right?
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So
The Last Battle. Is it The Last Battle? The one
with the robots?
with the Russians.
Oh,
Yeah, this should just be a feature. They should just make that into a feature movie. So I just thought I'd show you this, which is so all I've done is I've just taken the 2 pieces of art, I desaturated the shot, and then realised it looks absolutely horrific on the projector. So I increased the brightness so you could just bring it up slightly. But just as an example of when we think, because this isn't concept art, this is a shot. Okay, this is an actual piece of design for a shot for Carnival Row. There you go. It's a little bit clearer for you. So you've got the detective and his fairy ex-wife. So within that, yes, it's colourful, and yes, there's a clear theme, and the shot's there's an ever so slight Dutch angle on it. Can you see that? They've got a nice tilt on it. So it's really nicely designed, but it's important to remember that light still plays a part in this. So look at the variation of values. Even though it's colour, value still plays a really important part in breaking up that composition. So it does matter. It really, really does that you think in these terms, in terms of values. And then the other one I thought I'd show you is this one. And principally it's exactly the same. I'll probably take that off for this one. But can you see how it's not a singular set? It's not like a singular value. Yeah, you've actually got a gradient from the brighter area over here. So here's it in colour. Even though it's all just blue and grey, actually values are really present in this. Yeah, so you've got a gradient from here down to this side, like down to these darker, like lower values on the right-hand side. And by doing that, it means that when you create a strong silhouette of the characters on horseback, they pop, they stand out. And that's a great, and again, this is not just basic concept art, this is shot design. Okay, this is designing an actual sequence. All right, now I'm not asking you to, we're not working at this level, but this can only be done because a story artist went and did this ugly stuff. Yeah, because someone went in and went, I'm just gonna rough out a brief idea of the light, and a brief idea of the composition, and a brief idea of the placement of characters and the position of the camera. Okay, so that is your final task for this. I've got a feeling that the second forum spot, the second deposit space for the task 2 stuff didn't appear for you, so I'm going to check that this morning. But what I want is I know you've got a portfolio you've got to put together for the unit, but I want you to share your work with everyone else. So on Moodle, there'll be 3 places to post work. The first forum for the very early thumbnails, I asked you to like a mountain of thumbnails. The second one is the Spider-Man one, and the third one will be this file of these 6 interpretations. If you can, and I'll put the script on Moodle for you as well. It would be really helpful if you did this. So the actual pieces you've extracted from the script, place them in there so we can read what you're seeing and how you've brought it to life. Okay? Right, save your work. Yeah, we are kind of out of time. So the deadline for all this is your submission deadline for that work. All right, so you've got a little while to do it.